Now that we've gone through all the dances, we have to go through music, which is the second category. But here's the thing about music: music goes with dance, especially in Africa, because in Africa, the majority of the music is a percussion instrument, which creates a very certain type of style which is made for dancing. So, first, we have to look at ancient Egypt and what type of instruments they had. Secondly, we have to look at what instruments do North Africans have in general. And then, thirdly, we have to look at what other Africans have, general Africans have. And then finally, we have to look at our influence around the world. And this will include African Americans. So, what did ancient Egyptian music sound like? Well, we can at least boil it down to a few points. For example, ancient Egyptian music was based on a minor pentatonic scale of five full tones without half tones. This fact can be inferred from the position of the holes on flutes. So, the good news is African music is built off of the same minor pentatonic scale of five full tones. Sometimes six, sometimes seven, just depends. But it is based on five tones. And this will explain why Western music is not based on this scale.
These here are Africa's very special instruments. You only find them in Africa. We call them the hand piano because we haven't got a name for them. They call them, of course, likembe or mbira. As a matter of fact, there are dozens of names. You find them all over the place. This one comes from Zambezi, this from southern Rhodesia, this one up here, that's central Tanganyika. That's a very nice one. This little fellow here, that's Nyasaland's got a very sweet tone. That's a particularly sweet tone, little one. I only got it last year. This big one here, this fellow, comes from Uganda. He's the grandfather of the lot. I'm actually making one myself here. This little fellow I made myself, and you can hear. You see, the tuning is quite different. These have all sorts of tunings, pentatonic tunings, 5-note, 6-note, 7-note tunings, all different according to tribes. And they don't sound anything like ours. You see, that's quite English, you might say. You can even play Mr. Bach, shall we say.
As you can see from the reading that I was doing earlier, it was only during the New Kingdom when foreign conquest brought Egyptians into closer contact with Asiatic peoples and their music and many new instruments, and with them new sound qualities were introduced. They also encountered the scales prevailing in the Near East. On the whole, they seem to have preferred keeping their tradition tonality, although some musicologists think that during this period they began to use the heptatonic scale. The first genre of African music that we will talk about is call and response. This type of music is basically there's a lead singer who says something and then the other people join later. This is the foundation of a lot of genres in America, like blues or gospel and a lot of other genres.
Ho, Emma, ho. You turn around, dig a hole in the ground. Ho, Emma, ho. Ho, Emma, ho. You turn around, dig a hole in the ground.
Almost everything about that song is completely African. The rhythm I recognize immediately. the words are talking about planting, which would be very obvious to translate to African, but obviously had to do with probably the whole slavery thing. But then, more than that, there's a English bend to it, and you can see that there's a little bit of a struggle to make the words fit perfectly, unlike African languages.
Emma works harder than two grown men. Oh, Emma, oh, you turn around, dig a hole in the ground.
Something you also might have noticed is that there's a lot of humming in that song, and that humming has to do with more African music from Ethiopia, Somalia, Tanzania, Nigeria, and Southern Africa. It's funny because even the song Johnny Be Good that was released in 1958, you can still tell the rhythm is there. For example,
Oh, Emma, oh.
Go, Johnny, go, go.
these accidental similarities happen simply because they are singing the same genre, not because one's copying the other. And of course, you notice that clapping is central to these music types because clapping is the guide of the song. The second thing we will look at is drumming. And like I said, African drumming is poly music. It's many drums at one time creating this hypnotic effect. And if you play Ethiopian music outside of the mainstream and you just play the ones that are tribal, for example, the Omotic people, which are Afroasiatic, you will feel the Africanness jump at you. Even if you look at the Nilo-Saharans, as I show on the screen, their Africanness jumps at you. But for me, there's something a little more interesting than this. And it's the fact that the influence of the Middle East on Africa is well documented, but the influence of Africa on the Middle East is neglected. If I didn't know better, I would say that the Middle East has never been touched by Africa. Because when it comes to linguistics, they say that there is no influence. When it comes to music, they say there is no influence. When it comes to dance, they say there is no influence, even though you can see it, hear it. Now, a version of this dance is ancient to Phoenicia or the Levant in general, excluding Egypt. You never see this dance in Egypt, and therefore, by extension, you never see it in North Africa until the Arabs bring it. But you will notice that this dance is practiced in Greece, and the music that's used is typical of the Levantine area. And you will see that most Levantine music is played with those double flute things, or it's played, you've heard the sounds of Levantine, but you will see that with the addition of a giant drum, it completely changes the sound and therefore changes how you approach the dance. As you can see, the Phoenicians were armed with this instrument, harp and a tiny drum. You don't see a big drum anywhere, at least not being played. Now, it's not that these drums didn't exist in this region. Obviously, drums have existed everywhere in the world. It's how they're played. And the way that they're played in some of these dances are very reminiscent of Africa. And where exactly do you see this dance taking place in such a strong way? In Yemen. And who else is in Yemen? Black people. And they kept their rhythms. And like I read with the other verse, there was that ancient Arabian guy who said that the black Africans have the biggest amount of rhythm of all the people of the world. But don't believe me. Let me just show you a Greek version of this and show you that the drum is not an essential tool of this dance. As you can see, that dance is all a flute or guitar type instrument, and it really has no drum to it. It has like a shaker, which I think that's what they mistakenly call that drum. It was like some kind of shaker. And if you focus, you'll notice that there's a whole lot of symbols of this type of dance all over the European region and the like Levantine region away from Yemen. So what would the Africans have added to this dance? It's the stomping part, and then making it such a bigger leap than what it used to be. Clearly, the Africans modified this dance, and it was then taken by the occupants or the original occupants of this dance. Just listen to this African preserved by the black Yemenite people. And now listen to the Yemen version of that Greek dance that we saw that was started by the Phoenicians, which you would expect the drum to have been kept in all the versions of this dance if it started with a drum. But speaking of influence, let's go back to America. So the Americans wanted to make a new genre of music caused by the 60s, the American music had become stale. And so Steve Reich, a music composer, decided to use African drums as his base for what music could sound like. And he followed these hypnotic patterns.
But then a strange thing happened. In America, the two zones, contemporary pop and contemporary classical, gave birth to a child that was half one, half the other. The child's name was Minimalism. And the arrival of minimalism provoked a sea change in the relationship between musical genres. It ushered in an age of musical convergence, our age. Steve Reich has been described as the Reich is also the godfather of sampling, whereby a fragment of recorded sound is chopped up and recycled back into a musical pattern. Sampling is the bedrock of practically every hip-hop track you've ever heard. Sampling is even more ubiquitous in dance music than the electric guitar was in the rock music of the 1960s. Its genesis can be traced to a single work by Steve Reich in 1965, It's Gonna Rain. In It's Gonna Rain, Reich takes the recorded sermon of a Pentecostal street preacher and chops up segments of it to make rhythmic cells that are repeated again and again. Counterparts. David Bowie integrated minimalist styles from Reich and his fellow New Yorker Philip Glass into his 1977 album recorded in the shadow of the Berlin Wall, Low.
Virtually all the pop music from the 70s onwards was minimalistic music. Steve Reich was not the first person to take African drumming and turn it into other instruments. That was the Africans themselves. Like you read earlier, the African music relies on percussion, whether it's a flute, whether it's a guitar, whether it's any instrument. They're played as if they don't have strings and they're just hit like a drum. And so the Africans themselves did that first. And even if you notice, the call and response type of singing is kind of using your voice as a drum. But let's mention something about dancing quickly, because last time I didn't mention twerking. I purposefully left it out. But that's because I wanted to make sure that I can show you these videos. These are videos of women twerking from East, West, South, and North Africa. This dance, which has 100 names, I don't even want to waste time telling you, you can look at them up yourself, is typical African dance. And as you can tell, it's done all over the whole continent. So if the entire continent itself is embracing 3 completely different techniques that I've already shown you, it's actually more dances. There's like 10 more. Like, for example, that jumping thing that the Maasai do, which is also done by Nilotic people, and there's some Ethiopians that do it. There's people in Southern Africa that do it. There's Nigerians who do that thing of jumping, which again is probably a version of the stomp. But the twerking, for example, is all over the continent, and it's important outside of its sexual implications. It's important because it shows the maturing of a female, and you can see why this would be an important thing for these people in this culture. And then you can see in Egypt that they have these portrayals, and this would not be that impressive, the similarity, if it was the only similarity, because think about it. I said this before. Arabia stole some dances from Africa, and they're not going to admit that. This is one of them that is ubiquitous within the entire continent. So why wouldn't they have taken it? And you ask yourself, where do Arabs get it from? Well, they've got a whole network, 2 entire states. One, the empires of the Abyssinians that went into Yemen and took over for a while. Those guys could have brought it there. But then secondly, North Africa is like Africa's streamline into Arabia. Things get accepted there by the white population. And then when they're transferred, there isn't a racial block. Instead, they are just accepted. And I wouldn't dare accuse them of stealing this dance and the drumming if there wasn't a multi-directional pointing to that region of places that we know had less versions of these than they had after they conquered certain people. And I say that the Amazigh people, it's not that they stole the cultures of Africa, they used to be black. They were outbred, but their languages they kept and all these other things they kept, probably because it was majority male Arabs and black females.